Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
Periodically throughout the entire 190 episode series that is the Practice Podcast, my son Dave and I record conversations focused largely on one of his practices, which is to make pretty much a continuous study in search of the understanding of social inaction. That was his major work when he finished his dissertation. But there are elements of social inaction that dovetail perfectly into the question of practice. So we've been having these conversations. And this one takes us to another level because he has found a book, an author, whose work in the area of the nature of consciousness is very promising. So that's what we'll be talking about. But I think you're going to hear how this conversation takes us into what goes on moment to moment as people are striving to achieve whatever purposes they have in mind. In other words, practice. So here is my favorite son and my only son, Dave Fearon. Well, I'm delighted that we're able to continue learning about aspects of social inaction that have, in this case, much to do with our neurology, our neural systems. Dave has much better words than I, but Dave has continued his interest, long time interest in all matters of how the brain and the consciousness and everything related to that works, with a question mark, because it's going to be a question that probably won't be answered for another century. But in the meantime, it does lay into what we started in this series at the very beginning, where we talked about what happens in conversation. And essentially, there's one mind lined up and another lined up, and then something happens that they start taking turns sharing their thoughts. And so under the hood of that is a lot of what has interested Dave and continues to interest him. So what are we going to talk about tonight, Dave?
Well, I wanted to return to what we discussed in episode 174, where we were taking the inaction model that we've been talking about all along and getting into neuropsychology, neurophysiology with the work of Gerald Edelman. I noticed I was calling him Harold Edelman in the last podcast. His name is Gerald Edelman.
sorry, Gerald. We appreciate
his descendants. But your podcast is Practice ?
Yes.
And I think one of the things we've been doing in our series of talks is actually answering that question and trying to figure out exactly what it is. And we've looked at all different elements, mostly starting from the nature of conversation and talk. And then in that other episode, drilling into the brain. And one of the reasons, part of this has been kind of the tour of my eclectic studies from college through graduate school. And one early in some of the prior episodes, I talked about not only how I started, took some neurophysiology classes in the last few years of college, but I also did a senior project where I was combining that with social psychology, and in particular the pragmatist philosopher George Herbert Mead, which I describe on episode. Oh, I just had it here. Oh no, I lost the episode. One of our episodes. 50 something.
Yeah, it was quite a way back. We're at 190 right now. So
yeah,
but I remember that very well.
Yeah, and so in the odd course of things, at that time I was pulling together some of the systems theory work that I had we did another episode on Ilya Prigogine and other systems theories about self-organization, and that kind of worked into my graduate work as well. So what the odd thing is, had I kind of gone, instead of sociology, into neuroscience with all these ideas, I would have found myself in an alien world where the theories at the time didn't really deal with either the system dynamics or their implications, or topics that I was interested in, which was the nature of social interaction, and also to the degree that how the mind works and consciousness and subjectivity. It's still, had I gone into that direction only within the last 10 years or so, with, I think, the paradigm shifts now to where that perspective seems to be, I don't know if it's tipped the scale on popularity, but it's definitely has a lot of traction, and with including a number of the most highly cited neuroscientists are coming into these ideas, as are the applied ones getting into AI and building finally those robots computers that we could talk to, and they'll talk back and know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Where things get scary.
Maybe that's what kind of kicked it all up. You know, when the people who wanted to create something that thought like a human and acted like a human, AI, you know, and we used to talk about, well, they'll train this little puppy toy, you know, to respond to voice commands. But as they saw the mechanics, which I assumed it was prior to, you know, this 10 years, was looking at more at the mechanics of the brain, the wiring of the brain, the heat, all the things that could be observed and measured. They looked at the other things that interested you probably and said, you know, it's soft. Yeah, it's not science, but
yeah, brains are machines. They should be understood like machines, and
right.
Stimulus and response circuits.
They didn't want to talk about the mind as having something to do. But the good news is, they commercialized an awful lot of what they're trying to create, and in terms of machines that learn, and therefore those who contribute to the ideas and thoughts now and research. Probably I'll listen to a little bit more, and that will mean that you're being listened to.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, well, I think there's some convergence around, and one of the odd things was having shortly after doing that podcast on Gerald Edelman, his work being mostly in the 90s and late 80s when I ran into it. I was the magic of YouTube algorithms delivered me a few more recent works, one of which was a book by the person I'll talk about tonight, Mark Solms, Solms. He's a neuropsychologist, and also trained as a psychoanalyst in the Freudian tradition, as a way of reconciling how he got into neuroscience and trying to get into the even what Freud was talking about in his what he could do in those early days with what little was known about the brain. Kind of like George Herbert Mead at the turn of the 20th century. There was a lot of innovative thinking, even with Freud, that still resonates well with current neuroscience. And so Mark Solms wrote a book called The Hidden Spring. I think it was published 2019. And I've been slowly going through it. I've got like over 50 pages of notes. And because
that's a good book.
Well, yeah, but for me, it just filled in all those blanks, a lot of the blanks that we've been talking about in all our podcasts around self-organization and the brain and emotions, and potentially getting into what we talked about with the social bond and the nature of that. So what I'm going to try to do is start with summarizing some of the main points in his book and making some connections, some initial connections with what we talked about before. And then I think we'll do another podcast on one of the neuroscientists that he worked with more recently in doing this book, Carl Friston, who had a very interesting approach to that ties in more directly with what I've been talking about with self-organization and living systems. What I'm doing is I'm kind of doing he did an epilogue for the book that summarized all his main points. Luckily, it's because he was putting them together for a conference talk and figured he just put them in his book. So that's been very helpful. So I'll kind of go through those points and try to explain as I go. So he's based in South Africa and has been a practicing psychiatrist, but heavily researches neuroscience. And as I said, he was kind of inspired to agree by Freud, who proposed a biological basis for consciousness. But at the time, there wasn't enough neuroscience to even understand what memories were or anything like that. But the problem of what is consciousness has been referred to as the hard problem, and some such as David Chalmers in 1995 kind of coined this term, the hard problem of consciousness. Like as good as neuroscience could be, that he and others feel it's just you in all that detailed circuitry, you can never really capture what subjective awareness is of experiences, or how it works, how it is to know what it feels like to have vision or the color red, or really explain how it all works. And when we talked about George Herbert Mead and others and the nature of language, we've talked about aspects of consciousness, but there are still some nuts and bolts, even where we talked about Gerald Edelman and neuronal groups and such as that. How does subjectivity and consciousness really arise? And what Solms has pointed out is that one of the key things that are never really looked into and taken seriously is what's the nature of emotions and affect.
And that's a big part of your research and your doctoral studies, emotions.
Yeah, and so and also in relation to that, well, how is the brain a self-organizing living system, and how does that matter for consciousness? So if you think about conscious awareness, our subjective awareness, it's pretty clear that it's something that kind of emerges through functions of the brain that by and large are automatic. And there's a lot of just automatic things that we aren't consciously aware of. They're either in kind of the periphery of awareness, but really they kind of have to function automatically from habit, from reflexes.
Sure.
But also, talk is a very good example where we're talking to each other, but we couldn't even try to focus on what is the nature of all the phonemes and bits, and then the deeper meaning of each word that goes into being able to just rattle off words and understand each other. And just about every action has all of these sensory and motor relationships that don't necessarily require direct conscious experience. But he points out that affects or feelings, so felt feelings are different from, for example, the visual system, where if you look at a door frame, various number of systems in your brain are putting together the vertical and the horizontal lines and the colors and everything to assemble the experience of a door. But it takes that, something more to be able to name it as a door and act towards it as a door. But with feelings, you actually feel them. You feel them every time. There are always subjective experiences, and there's something different about that given that feelings must be part of any conscious experience, he's looking at how affect may be what actually accompanies any cortical activity, any other brain activity that would include subjective awareness, so that if we are conscious of something, we are having something going on with our emotion systems. And we talked a little bit about where those are. They are, you have the neocortex, the gray matter, where so much attention is focused on, the secrets of consciousness must be in here. But no, it's down in underneath those layers. You have the limbic system, but even beyond that, you have the brain stem. And in the upper brainstem, there's a tiny region called the reticular activating system. It's the size of a match head. And if that area is damaged, that's where consciousness seeks. You are in a coma, you're gone.
Wow.
But people can have massive damage and disruption to their cortex and still be conscious. That he described some patients, I think he even worked with some, who had like 90% of their cortex was just gone, and they're so they're chugging along with like 10% of their cortex, and yet they're conscious. They're able to do they're able to talk and have self-consciousness, understand themselves, know what's going on. They've got problems here and there, but they're still, you describe them as not having lost consciousness because they've lost so much of their gray matter. And babies, there's a type of disease. I should have written it down. It's not encephalitis, but
hydrocephalus, isn't it, where the brain gets there's.
Yeah, this is like I think it's the opposite of that. But basically the babies are born without any cortex.
Oh,
basically, just born with a brain stem.
Yeah.
But if you look at them, you could still describe them having kind of a conscious type awareness and reaction to the world. Is mostly reflex, but it's also emotion. They'll fuss when they're uncomfortable, and like he had like a little girl when her baby brother was put on her chest, she expressed joy, and
my goodness. So all from that little
no, she'll never
brainstem.
Yeah, those babies will never speak, and those higher activities aren't there, but there's still this core of what I think could probably be called consciousness. So this, and the other interesting, so just right there, the importance of affective feelings is certainly there, but he looks more at, well, what is it that affect is doing? He frames it as one of the essential parts of the brain and the living animals, including humans, as self-organizing systems. And we talked about those with Ilya in the episode with Ilya Prigogine, where any living system could be described as self-organizing. It's operating in it's a system of which its parts operate in a limited set of states with the functions that are essentially dissipating or removing entropy. They're adjusting to the environment that they encounter in a way that decreases the destructive activity or the potential basically chaos that would disrupt their essential set of components. So looked at as a whole, then an animal or person would be would be maintaining what he calls homeostasis, what Prigogine will call kind of a far from equilibrium stable state, but you can describe it as homeostasis. Too far in one direction, even if your body temperature too high or too low, you're dead. So the biological organism was doing things
Preserving.
to make something like that's a priority. Airflow is a priority. Food and such a priority, and evolution built up around the signals for problems in homeostasis. So you could think of it as a self-organizing system oriented to survival of the whole. And this survival imperative gives an intentionality, a kind of a goal of operation to the continued existence of the biology as a whole, and also the brain and parts of the brain that sustain the whole. And you can think of this as a type of a subjective function, because if you have self-oriented action in relation to an external world that's defined, the world being defined in part by that very action, that interaction with the world, you could think of it as generating a point of view within the system itself, kind of an observer to the systems to which the organism is coupled in this really close structural causal way. So I mean, that's a property of any living systems, but within the brain in particular, affect are really evolved to maintaining those homeostatic balances, in which they're registering deviations from a range of perturbations, which you can describe as responses to bodily needs. And so it lends to these needs it's kind of the ranges from that might be felt in some cases as pleasure or unpleasure, good or bad things that are happening. But with emotions, you see that these different needs are categorized, like hunger, need for breath, reproduction, with affects that go along with them. Yeah, they have distinctive qualities, and so there's a number of affect. He kind of summarizes what's general agreement around the core affects that we all live with constantly. There are 7 of them that he lists. They are lust, rage, fear, panic or grief, care, like caretaking, play, which is an interesting one, meaning basically the need to, we could talk about that later, but the need to actually socially interact to some degree. And then there's another one called seeking, and which is kind of like a general curiosity that kind of keeps us oriented towards something new. Yeah. Basically, he describes it as kind of almost like a foraging. So an animal will, even if it's finished eating and there's still food there and he's satisfied, he might still have the seeking instinct to go look for more food, make sure the environment will still provide something for the future if the food runs out. So yeah, and that extends kind of into all sorts of aspects. We had talked about shame and guilt and pride. He kind of lists those as possibly composite emotions, combinations of these basic ones, and he didn't get too much into it. I might look into more of that for a later podcast and see what we can make of it. But really this sense of affect that are arising with perturbations to the system's homeostasis. One aspect of it, which has really come to be a I think the dominant model, even in cognitive psychology, is that we're thinking of this as an error in prediction activity. So if you have a system that's kind of keeping within normal bounds, one way it's doing it is constantly predicting what needs are relevant that might be coming up.
Mm-hmm. That's the seeking part, I guess.
Yeah, or just in general, anything is kind of projecting what would keep the system within normal bounds. Mm-hmm. And then encountering the real world in which there's always novelty.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the relationships among the core brainstem area and the limbic system and the rest of the brain is around exchanges of prediction errors. So yeah, and I'll go
surprise. Like I can see.
Yeah, surprise,
shock.
Yeah. So
disappointment.
To some degree, you're constantly modeling what the future may be,
mm-hmm.
And then having to adjust those models.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what happens when those error signals are coming is they're all funneled down. They're like literally the neuronal axonal groups all funnel down through a couple parts of the brain. One of them is the thalamus, but another is this area around the peri. Should have highlighted it. Periaquid. My notes are too small.
No, you're getting old. That's what's happening.
The periaqueductal gray. It's a little region, and it's where all this affect circuitry converges. It's also where a lot of these neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin, they'll flood around and be part of this system. And it's having this heavy interaction. So that what happens here is very basic. This is a category of fear. It's in heavy interaction with the cortex that's going to spin out this impulse into complex sensory motor relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That are taking what was a prior sensory motor relationship that was more predictive, and then adjusting to making that predictive adjust back down to the needs of the moment, which are kind of framed in
mm-hmm.
terms of the emotion or feelings. So you have this, and this is all, it's pretty well, there's pretty good evidence now in how the different parts of the brain work in the circuitry here, where you have emotions, like there's a between this area in the midbrain and in the brain stem, and then in the midbrain there's another set of circuitry which kind of takes these emotions and ranks them in terms of relevance and salience for the moment. So there's a prioritizing, like you don't necessarily, like if you're in a situation where you're both afraid but also can't breathe,
mm-hmm.
you might because you fell in the water.
I would go with the breathing first. Yeah,
you go with the breathing first, get out of the water, and then wonder how you got in there in the first place. And there's lots of very context dependent needs and prioritizing that's right. Being dealt with mainly by the forebrain. And so from there you get kind of these very simple emotions and reflexes being built out into the more complex sensory motor relationships that have more to do with our memory and our learning and all the different ranges of actions that might help solve that problem.
Incredible.
So you have emotions kind of prioritizing need. And, so a lot of the work of the brain is around minimizing uncertainty, maximizing confidence in the predictions that might meet needs. Somewhere in here is kind of a mechanical explanation of how consciousness works. I think to get more into it, we would start getting into his couple of different chapters on bringing in this work of Carl Friston on self-organization, what he calls the free energy principle. But I'll say just a little bit more about where this argument leads in terms of practice.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about practice sort of in these terms before, where the practitioner, especially ones it's easy to think about someone who's in the golf pro,
Mm-hmm.
who is a practitioner of a really good swing. It becomes mostly an automatic process,
Right.
when it's carried out. The more thinking you do, the worse your swing may become, actually. But if you had to explain it, then you are getting into a situation where you have to bring various aspects of it into consciousness, and into discourse, and being able to talk about it. And of course, for what humans can do, and it becomes kind of a process where something that was initially very efficient and low energy by way of the brain's ability to carry it out,
Mm-hmm.
becomes actually slower and broken up into parts and having to be potentially adjusted given a novel situation. So this might be something where all of a sudden, like, you had a shoulder injury and it's giving you pain, and it's decreasing your range of motion, and this is kind of messing up your golf swing.
Oh yeah.
In a way that you wouldn't have thought of before, but now you have to put more energy into figure out how to overcome that, adjust yourself. So in a way, a lot of the prediction work, which originally the automatic part of practice would be, you could almost think of it as the memories.
Yeah.
The muscle memory that allowed you to do these things without any consciousness has to be put back into consciousness, and in order to modify those memories, essentially.
Yeah. They don't work but those very automatic memories they keep trying to make the shoulder do the same thing, but now the shoulder has pain. So it's like, oh, so even I think before you're able to put it into thought and word and action, you're already picking up on the pain, and it didn't even bother you until you picked up the golf club and swung, because otherwise it was just a routine kind of soreness. But now you realize, oh, it's going to affect my swing. And if he's a pro, that's an emotion on itself, because he's trying to show people his perfect swing and is going,
right.
So it becomes social. But
so in another interesting aspect of it, so philosophers will often say, well, is there free will? And some people who are really into the more mechanical neurophysiology will say, no, it's all automatic. If you can explain the right set of memories and affect, then you've got a calculation that's basically doesn't need free will to work. But Solms is arguing that it's really with these moments where affect is spinning these normally automatic actions into something that needs to be taken apart, prioritized, associated with needs. This is actually an activity of volition, essentially choice.
Yeah.
And conscious choice. It's literally conscious, because you, by feeling something, you've now kind of taken this position of the observer of that which normally would be not perceived as directly. It's now basically building up the world that you are perceiving at that moment in terms of what you might do about it, and connecting to actions, motor activity,
Mm-hmm.
all of and even given choices, which you can then have internal discussion about. Humans can do it with words. Animals can kind of do choices amongst their range of possible actions.
Mm-hmm.
So he does a better job really getting into the details of how that's a solution, but I think it's there. I think this combination of the physiology, the systems dynamics, accounts for quite a bit of what people have been calling the hard problem of consciousness, mostly because they're looking in the wrong place. They weren't acknowledging some of this real basic circuitry around emotions, homeostasis, right. Prediction, the highly predictive nature of cognition, and what that means for practice. So again, what you get from these unpredictable actions is turning a practice into something that has to be, more actively, interactively brought into consciousness and potentially revised. So
that's the work right there.
Yeah, but the brain, in a way, as far as its energy consumption, would prefer to be unconscious most of the time, like a zombie.
Oh, I know how that feels.
Because
a good nap.
Yeah, so things kind of tend towards this automatic practice. Mm-hmm. It's energy efficient, but the world doesn't let us have everything be predictable.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and we also have that seeking drive, which Freud actually was referring to with the notion of libido, where you're proactively engaging with uncertainty in order to get ahead of the game, because most animals would not have survived well in their evolution had they not looked for trouble and prepared ahead of time. So it kind of gives us that feeling of curiosity towards an interest in the world.
This is really does what we said at the beginning. It really begins to pull an awful lot together. And I remember when you were reading that book this summer and you were excited about it. Now I understand why. It does make some intellectual assembly of consciousness in a very more for me as a layman, a very understandable way. As you were describing those things, I could picture in my head what Peter, for example, said in his way of thinking about practice, which it's a conscious ability to continually pursue a stream of results reasonably with constant adjustments to the circumstances of this and the situation that the circumstances produce. And at any point along the way, if you will, going forward, the seeking part, you will arrive at a moment where you're likely to learn something and grow with it. So now I'm hearing it saying, okay, well, maybe that's the big scheme, but if you bring that down to even what happens in a few moments, a few instants, in just a few seconds, depending on what those circumstances are around you, that your mind is working, sorting through the emotions, prioritizing, saying, well, pay attention to that, but don't worry about this.
Right.
And that work is going on all the time. It's not like you don't learn anything and suddenly you're in a context. Now I'm learning. You're learning all the time. And
right.
And you didn't use the word learning. I'm throwing that in there. Maybe the next episode as we continue to probe some, we'll see how some of these conventional terms like learning can be better explained in the way that his model and your interpretation of the model go. But
yeah,
so I think why don't we put a pin on this and summarize for the moment, because for the sake of time, and then we'll schedule the next part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we can. I'll summarize it in terms of, I'll make just one connection going back to George Herbert Mead.
Okay.
Because because back when I was looking at what he was writing around the early 1900s, he was arguing against the behaviorism of the time, the stimulus response,
Right.
by making a more complex model. So his theory of the act started as a sequence, actually not even a sequence, but kind of almost a set of aspects. But they begin with the impulse. When impulse, perception, manipulation, consummation.
Mm-hmm.
And you could, and in reading Psalms now, you could really think of this as not just the social act, not just the act, but the conscious act, the act that becomes conscious, because it's the impulse has that emotion aspect, but it comes from largely an error in prediction, predicting what came before, and having to deal with that as a perturbation, which spins up, activates the impulses. Is really down at this brainstem emotional level. It becomes what the salience or relevance by which one starts to construct and literally construct perception.
Mm-hmm.
So it's highly accepted that vision and all sensory information isn't just in external information, it's interactive. We talked about that with Gerald Edelman.
That's
sensory motor relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So perception is this building, all with this valence of sensory motor relationships, which Mead calls meaning. He defines meaning as a tendency to act, which is this adding of what the relevant manipulation of the world might be that will deal with this impulse. Mm-hmm. And so manipulation stage is when one is actually contacting the world. There's going to be some ongoing adjustment that will lead to the fourth stage, consummation. And the consummation may resolve that original need of the impulse, but it also can flood back to, well, what was learned? What was the precision of my earlier perception and my new solution for manipulation that then that basically becomes the basis of learning and improving one's practice. So,
wow. Mead was right, and you always said that. I mean, you really embraced. And think of what it took for him to just sit there and sort of think that out. He didn't have anywhere near the tools or the information sets or anything. He just he philosophically looked. Yeah,
he studied a little bit of neurophysiology in Germany back then, maybe around the same time Freud was. But it's like, well, people cut open brains and looked at him and said, well, there, it's just gray stuff. So,
well, you're advancing the state of the art, and I, folks, I will promise you that we're going to learn more. And I want, when Dave resumes our conversation, we'll review those 7 elements there. Those are quite fascinating, and maybe figure out a little bit about how Soames came up with them. They all made a lot of sense to me when you put them all together. So,
and he didn't get much into language. He said one very interesting thing I want to follow up on is that play may actually have more to do with language than we might think. I find that intriguing, especially because it relates to the social bond. So we'll make that at least one episode. So
sounds great. Well, thanks an awful lot, Dave, for instructing the old man and making me feel like I actually am on to something in my fascination with practice with a question mark. So thank you.
And go ahead and YouTube Mark Soames. He has many good, more clear talks about his book than I've given.
Okay, thank you.
Search on YouTube. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to anactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Oh, and one more thing. How could I forget? The book on practice as a way of being is available now in digital form, something that would be new, like podcasting to many of us. And it's a great way of learning more and more about what this podcast presented when Peter Vale and I originated it several years ago. So please come to mylibrary.world/practice, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you.